Hi, everyone. Pastor Bruce, Arkport Presbyterian Church, and now we're ready for another video on biblical archaeology. I know I promised you a video on the Pool of Siloam, and as I was thinking about the Pool of Siloam, I thought to myself, we really shouldn't do that without first having a lecture on King Hezekiah. And then I thought to myself, wow, this is a really busy week. And to do a good job on King Hezekiah, I couldn't possibly finish that in time. So we have a different topic, and it is about an ongoing excavation in Jerusalem known as the Ophel Excavation. And so with that, I'm going to minimize this inset of me and push that off to the side, and we'll get to our lecture. As always, the purpose of our lecture is not just to delight and entertain, but it's also to educate. Educate about historical facts and artifacts that have been found. Yes, educate about some things in Scripture to help us understand what they might mean when we encounter them, but also to help us learn about biblical archaeological techniques, things that are useful for archaeologists who are working in this time period of a few thousand years ago. Well, with that, let us get going on the Ophel excavation in Jerusalem. Well, to start with, to do that, we'll need to know where is the Ophel. And what you have on the right-hand side is an artistic rendering of the Old Testament city of Jebus. You may remember that when the Hebrews were given their land, the promised land in Canaan, they still had to go in and conquer it. And so under Joshua, the Hebrews entered into the promised land, and they took city after city that had been promised and to be divided amongst the 12 tribes. One of the cities that they were supposed to have conquered and divided was the city of Jebus, occupied, if you will, by the Jebusites. Well, in Joshua's time, they didn't conquer that city. And even during the era of the judges, they didn't conquer that city. But King David would. And when he conquered the city, he made that the capital of his kingdom. He made that Zion. He made that the city of David. And he kept the original boundaries of the Jebusite city, but he fortified the walls and he expanded the palace that was built inside the city. Well, it's a smallish city, and we'll get to that in a little bit of while in later slides. But to the north side of the city is a place known as Ophel, and farther north is Mount Moriah, where the temple would be built by David's son, Solomon. Now, if you go to visit Jerusalem today, you think, well, there's not much difference in space between this site and the Ophel and Mount Moriah. And indeed, it is not very far. It easily walked in a few minutes. So we shouldn't get too excited by the idea that these are different places. No, they are merely city blocks apart before there was a city and blocks to mark them. Ophel or Ophel is a Hebrew word which has a generic meaning. It just means a rise or a swell or a mountain or things that lead upward. And it can be used in a generic sense in any day conversation if one wants to talk about a hill or a rise or a swell. But it also is used as biblical language for this specific place, which is why it's called the Ophel. And we see a place in 2 Chronicles, a couple of places where it's described. It is also used in Nehemiah in 3 instances, speaking about this location within Jerusalem that has a particular rise that goes from the old city of Jebus to Mount Moriah, where the temple was built in both the first and second temple periods. Okay, so now we know where the Ophel is. It is on the south side of where the temple will be built. and it's on the north side of the old city of Zion. Now, this is a picture from of a model, a very large model that one can go and see today in Jerusalem. And this model has a lot of details to it. It is a model of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. And one can see that there is a bunch of white dots surrounding the old city of Zion. And then there is another circle of dots surrounding the region known as the Ophel. And you can see in the background is the temple, the second temple, the Herodian temple on Mount Moriah or on Temple Mount. And so this is a model of the Jerusalem that Jesus would have been familiar with. And if you go to visit Jerusalem today, it's what you would also be able to understand as you walk through, that the city of Jerusalem has grown up mostly to the west and to the north from the original city, that the Ophel is this rising area that is south of the Temple Mount. That leads us to this picture. In this picture, I want to start with what we see in the background. In the background, you see a wall that looks like a medieval wall. And indeed, it's exactly what it is. Old Jerusalem, if you visit it today, has this medieval looking wall because it is a medieval wall that surrounds it. In medieval times, that's all there was to Jerusalem that you could find, was the small area that was encircled by this medieval wall. Above this wall, you see a black dome. That black dome is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is the third most sacred or most important mosque in Islam, and it's there on the Temple Mount. Well, below the Temple Mount, on this rising hill, on this Ophel, is this excavation that's taking place where we are discovering wonderful things from antiquity of old Jerusalem in the Ophel area. Well, in this area, we have this excavation, and what we find, amongst other things, is this black tarp. What is this black tarp all about? Is it there to protect the site from the weather? Well, sometimes a tent is set up to protect the site in rainy season from being washed out as people are digging in the dirt. Let's not have to dig in mud. Let's not make the task more difficult. But in the summertime, when it's very hot, the tents are set up to shelter the diggers from the harshness of the sun and the heat of the day. Normally, they'll start their work very early in the morning before sunrise, and usually by 2 o'clock, the work on an archaeological site is done because the cool of the day is much better than the heat of the afternoon. If you look at this tarp, you might notice that you can actually see through it at the top and in a few places, and that is because it is a very breathable structure. It's designed to block the sun, allow hot air to rise and go through the top, and therefore bring in cooling air from the side. So this tarp, I do believe, is there intended to protect the workers, to provide them a work environment that is habitable for them so they can last longer at their jobs. Well, let me say that this site has benefited from some biological material or organic material. And when you find organic material at a site, it is a big boon. That is a wonderful thing to find. These diggers are finding some grapes or grape pits or some carbonized grapes there at the base of what's known as Building 2 or Building 11. And the idea of organic material, when you find it, whether it's olives or grapes or dates or wood or animal bones or human skeletons, whenever you find material that comes from something that was living, then there is the opportunity to date that material using carbon-14 radio dating. And I won't go into details about carbon-14 radio dating. I do have an extensive video lecture, which I will postpone until later because, quite frankly, I think many of you would not be interested in the technology and the theory that goes into radiocarbon dating. But let me say that this technique is an important technique. It is highly accurate, especially for the period of time that we are interested in, which is less than 5,730 years ago. So anything that is organic has both carbon-12 and carbon-14 mixed within it. Carbon-12 is stable and carbon-14 is radioactive, and it decreases with time, it decays with time. Half of it disappears over the span of 5,730 years. And so based on the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, we can date things quite accurately with radiocarbon-14 dating. And one of the things that you see in that chart in the upper left-hand corner of this slide is that we've compared radiocarbon-14 dating with aging of trees, tree rings. And that's another technique that is very important to biblical archaeology, is what we call dendrochronology, that we look at the rings of trees and we are often able to date things based on rings. And the rings, another lecture perhaps, the rings don't have to be from a tree that lived the entire time. But if the pattern of rings from one tree compares to a pattern of rings from another tree, we may be able to find the dates that were common of flood seasons and very dry seasons in both those sets of rings of different trees that lived over different time periods, but they had overlapping periods that we can find. And then we can take a series of trees, fossilized and otherwise, and create a map of the dates that enable us to work backwards through that time period where the dig takes place. So radiocarbon-14 dating and dendrochronology are two techniques that are pertinent to biblical archaeology that enable us to date some digs. Well, I'd like to introduce one of our star archaeologists of our age, and that's Dr. Eilat Mazar. She is from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem's Department of Archaeology. It is an archaeology department that is not hostile to the understanding of the Bible. There are other archaeological schools that are hostile to the Bible, but the University of Jerusalem is not one of them. Dr. Eilat Mazar has been working this Ophel site, working at it, over the past 40 years. Not continuously. The site has not been active continuously over those 40 years, but it is currently active, and some wonderful finds are being discovered even as we speak. She is the granddaughter of another famous biblical archaeologist. I say biblical archaeologist who is working in the promised land, if you will, working in Israel. So they are really digging up evidence that either informs or speaks to or questions the stories that we find in the Bible. Her grandfather was Dr. Benjamin Mazar. Now, this particular site at the Ophel is not a new site. It has been discovered a long time ago, but the new discoveries are what we find as we have gone deeper with much more zeal and interest because of recent discoveries. One of the heroes who worked in this area is Captain Charles Warren. He's important as discovering and navigating Hezekiah's tunnel, which will be important in our Pool of Siloam lecture. Then there's Kathleen Kenyon, a very important archaeologist in the ancient Near East and in Israel. And of course, we mentioned Benjamin Mazar and his granddaughter, Eilat Mazar. And she writes this, that we have been making significant finds from the first temple period in this area, in the Ophel. And the first temple period is the time from when King Solomon built the temple, King Solomon being David's son, built the temple on Mount Moriah until it was destroyed about 400 years later in the Babylonian conquest in 586 BC. So we are in that temple period where they are currently making discoveries. One of the discoveries, one that was published in 2015, is a bulla of King Hezekiah. It actually says King Hezekiah, son of Ahaz. And indeed, King Hezekiah was the son of King Ahaz. And there was this bulla, which I'll describe a little bit more perhaps on the next slide, but it is a means of sealing, especially documents, so that you know that they come, if you will, with the sanction of the king. And the fact that it would say son of Ahaz is not just a gratuitous head nod or, hey, I'm somebody because I'm not only king, but I'm son of a king. But there was a time when both King Ahaz and King Hezekiah were co-regents, just as at the end of Hezekiah's life, he was a co-regent with his son Manasseh. They were co-regents for about 10 years. Now, this particular bulla, which is made of clay, the front has this impression that, I don't know, looks a lot like a moth. But on the back, we know what it was pressed against. It was pressed against a fabric, a parchment, and we see the impression of the parchment on the back of this clay. So we're quite confident this was pressed against a document, and it was the seal on the document. And as often happens with bulla, we have a hand drawing to help us see the detail that maybe our naked eye has a hard time seeing. And we even find that there are some details that are dotted in there because they are what we expect to find, perhaps because we found them on other Hezekiah bulla that were found elsewhere, or that is the interpretation, anyway, of the archaeologist who's reconstructing it. All right, very well. Let's go on. What is a bulla? Well, a bulla is a lump of soft clay that is often about fingernail sized, and it's placed on something that you want to seal. Now, if it's a parchment that's been rolled up, and one takes a cord and ties it around tightly so that the document can't really be pulled out of the cord that's been wound around it without tearing the parchment, oh, that's good. So then if the parchment isn't torn, you know it hasn't been pulled out. Well, how do you know they didn't just unwrap the parchment? Well, you put this soft clay on top of the cord in a way that presses through the cord, and then you take the seal and you press it on top of the soft clay. And then when you take off the seal, the impression is there on the soft clay, and you allow the soft clay to harden, and then you're ready to transmit the document by courier. And that document, if the bulla is broken or the document is torn, you will be suspicious that it has been read. And we have some biblical examples of exactly this sort of thing happening. And I think the more interesting one that I tee up for us today is from 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 7 and 8. It's about Jezebel, the queen of King Ahab. And this is what it reads. Jezebel, his wife, said, "Is this how you act as the king of Israel?" You see, Ahab wanted to get some property from Naboth, and Naboth didn't want to sell the property to the king, and so he was pouting, and Jezebel is taking that up with the king. "Is it this how you act as the king of Israel? Get up and eat, cheer up. I will get you the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite." And so she wrote letters in Ahab's name and placed his seal on them and sent them to the elders and the nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. You see, you get a letter that says it's from the king. Okay, is it really from the king? Oh, it has a seal on it that says it is from the king. And then I know that there aren't these counterfeit seals around. There better not be. This is the seal of the king. It's stamped, and I'm confident that this came from the king. And that's how Jezebel impostered herself, if you will, pretended that she was King Ahab and got what she wanted. Well, on the right-hand side is another bulla. I don't really care about the individual who is listed on this bulla. We'll have a whole lecture on bulla at some time, or bullae, plural of bulla. But I wanted to show a picture of what 1 centimeter was. We said they're about thumbnail size. This is a centimeter sized bulla, and you see it with a picture of a thumb, and you say, okay, I get a good sense of just how small these little clay tablets were. They're like little buttons pressed into the cord, allowed to dry there after the seal has been stamped, so we know who is sending. Well, not too far from the Hezekiah bulla found in the Ophel excavation is this other bulla that is from Isaiah. I said Elijah. I meant Isaiah. And it's a Jewish name that is the same as Isaiah. There are a number of ways to spell Isaiah, but this is one of the ways to spell Isaiah. And it says not only Isaiah on the middle line, but on the bottom, it says almost the word prophet. The word prophet is Navi, and it has a number of letters in the spelling of Navi. The last letter actually happens to be silent. It's an aleph. It's a letter that has no vocalization, but it needs to be there if it's the word for prophet. Well, this bulla is damaged, and it's missing that last letter. So we have Isaiah, and then we have Navi, but improperly spelled, if you will. It's missing that last letter. And the question is this from Isaiah the prophet? Well, it was found in the same layer as the King Hezekiah bulla. It was found 10 feet from the King Hezekiah bulla. The prophet Isaiah is a very important prophet in the life of King Hezekiah. He served with him for decades, and no king and prophet are more mentioned together than King Hezekiah and Isaiah. In fact, I think it's more than 24 times that Isaiah and King Hezekiah occur in the same biblical verse, the same verse, 24 times or more. And so if one is very cautious, one says, it looks like it could be the prophet Isaiah. And if one is a little less cautious, one says it must be from the prophet Isaiah, acknowledging that it doesn't perfectly say that because it's missing a silent letter at the end. And so people say, well, it could be Isaiah, and that could be, on the bottom line, his last name. It could be something else, could be a city he's from. Not sure what it would be if it wasn't Isaiah, if it wasn't the prophet. But are you sure? No. Can't be positive, although we can be pretty confident. Anyway, that was also found in this marvelous excavation at Ophel. Well, how was it found? Well, interestingly enough, as you know, we're interested in technologies that are used in biblical archaeology. This bulla from King Hezekiah was dug up in 2009, but it wasn't discovered until 2015, just 5 years ago. How is that possible? Dug up in 2009, discovered in 2015. Well, enter wet sifting. So when we are doing excavation, we're looking for things that we can see with our eye and say, oh, that's an interesting thing. Let's dust around it. Let's very carefully carve around it. If you see a pot head or the handle of a pot or a large piece of ostrakhan, a pottery that's been written upon. If you see an earring, you know, oh, it jumps out and you're very careful to dig around it. But what are you digging? Well, you're digging rubble. It turns out that we have discovered, oh, rubble oftentimes contains really important information. And that's because rubble is not always just rubble. It's not always just rocks. Yeah, I told you that the bullae are usually only about 1 centimeter big. They're only about the size of a thumbnail. Yes, and they are the same color as the dirt in often cases because it's clay. It's the color of dirt when the dirt is clay colored. And so as you're looking for things that jump out at you like pot handles and pottery and gold and grapes and dates and bones, you're picking up all the rocks. Well, in days of old, we just throw all that away and not give it a second thought. But now we save it in buckets. And in that bucket, we label it. When was that bucket put together? Where in a grid matrix of X and Y, of latitude and longitude, if you will, of east, west, and north, where was that bucket filled? And at what level, what stratum, at what depth was that bucket filled? So that that bucket and its provenance, its integrity of where it comes from is not lost. Well, you can dig ground a lot faster than you can sort everything out. And so for 6 years, that bucket was waiting to be sifted, to be wet sifted. What is wet sifting? Well, I have a picture on the right, and as you might imagine, it involves water. So I take that bucket and I pour it into a screen mesh and I wash it down. I want to wash off all the dust. There isn't much information to be found in dust. And I wash off all the dust. And I'm left with all the pieces of rock and pottery and clay and anything else, any artifact that's bigger than the mesh. And the mesh might be chicken coop size. It might be, you know, some smaller mesh. You see the size that we're looking at. And after I've rinsed off all the dust, my volunteer looks at each and every piece. Does this have writing on it? Does it have an inscription on it? Does it look peculiar? Does it look like it doesn't belong with all these other things? And if it looks out of place, oh, you call one of the archaeologists over to look at what it is that you found. And if it is something that has an inscription on it like a bulla, it is a great find. It is a wonderful thing. And so because of wet sifting, this new technique, we are finding all sorts of bulla in our digs all around the country. And what we find out is that it must have been a quite literate people so that we would have all this information on things that were being sent around, whether they are merchandise or whether they are letters. We'd find these seals all around so that people would know from whom they came and perhaps what they were. And anyway, that is wet sifting, and another technique that is kind of new to biblical archaeology, very important, giving rise to all sorts of finds of bulla that in the years past were probably just thrown away with the rubble of an excavation. How very sad. These are other bullae and symbols that were found in Ophel. I think there are 62 maybe that have been found, perhaps hundreds actually. I want to rephrase that. I think there are hundreds that have been found in the Ophel. Many of them are biblical characters, and that's where my 62 came from. I believe we have found 62 characters that are in the Bible. We have found physical evidence, archaeological evidence, naming them. And when we get to the bullae lecture, I think that'll be fun. Now here we have some bullae from a very rich family, the Bees family. And the Bees family, there are 3 generations of them being identified on bullae. and it's clear that they were in charge of a lot of commerce that was taking place. As we find their names on jug handles, we find their names on bulai. So they had seals. Everybody would know who the Bees family was if they lived in the time of King Hezekiah. This is forget all the words on the left-hand side. You're free to stop the film at any time, the video, and read all those words, but I'm not going to talk to them. I'm going to talk to this seal that's found on the backside of a jar handle. And it has a name. I won't attempt to pronounce that name, but why this seal is important is this jug handle was found in the Ophel excavation. It's tightly provenanced. That's a word I used before, and it's an important word to archaeology. Provenance means that there is a trail of custody that can be reconstructed. We know where it was found, we know who had it, and we know how it was found. And so we also know with the context in which it was found, what was next to it when it was found. It helps us to date it, and it helps us to establish the authenticity of that piece, so it's not a piece of forgery that has been put together. And so this is a highly provenanced find because it's a scientific dig. Those two words go together, or the scientific dig and the provenanced find, they belong together. This handle has a seal. This seal is a seal that we have found on other jugs that are less well provenanced, found around Jerusalem, found in cities, in other sites, other cities. And some of them are scientific digs, but sometimes objects are found, if you will, in the antiquities market. You can think of those as grave robbers. They are people who are not scientists, they are treasure hunters, maybe not grave robbers, treasure hunters. And they are interested in digging up stuff that they can sell on the antiquities market, but they're not that interested in the science, and they're not that interested in properly recording where they found it and how. And sometimes there's probably a good and legal reason why they are less interested. And oh, by the way, on the antiquities market, you can buy things and you don't know who the discoverer was, and they may or may not tell you a city, but you may or may not have reason to believe that it was found in that city when you buy things on the antiquities market. But because of this seal, we know that this seal belongs to an individual who dates to King Hezekiah's time, and that helps us deal with all the other pieces that we have found elsewhere in Judah. So that's kind of exciting. Last slide. We found this seal that has no inscription, no names on it. If I was tasked to describe what it is we're looking at, it looks like a snake rising out of a canoe that's propped up on a bunch of sticks. It turns out that's why I'll keep my day job and not pretend that I'm an archaeologist. Archaeologists and those who deal with these types of artifacts tell us that this is a falcon. Well, who knew? And they tell us that it is found in the same context as King Hezekiah's bulla, and it's a falcon. But if you look at your Bible, you won't find really how the falcon is associated with royalty. Although that's exactly what this footnote of this image says, that the falcon is a symbol associated with royalty. Yes, but not in Hebrew culture. But it is, for sure, in Egyptian culture and others. In Egyptian culture, we know that the god Horus took on the symbol and was represented by a falcon. And we have a couple of representations there in this lower part. These representations were not found in the Ophel excavation. I just put them here for our own edification. And you might be able to see a resemblance now between that drawing and the falcon. But you might ask, so what does that have to do with biblical archaeology? Why would there be a symbol of a falcon when the falcon is not a biblical symbol? Well, did you remember that in the bulla of King Hezekiah that there were two Anks. Well, there was an Ank in it, and believed that there was a second Ank. The Ankh is an Egyptian symbol. It's not a Jewish symbol. It's an Egyptian symbol, a symbol of life. But at the time of King Hezekiah, he had had allegiances with Egypt, very important allegiances to defend against Assyrian oppression. And we'll cover that in next week's lecture on King Hezekiah. Well, if the king's very own seal can have an Egyptian symbol on it of the Ankh, it's plausible that this falcon is somehow associated with King Hezekiah, even though the Bible is not that keen on falcons as symbols of royalty. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that symbol. And that brings us to the end. Oh, there is one more Hezekiah seal that's been found. There are two. Both of them say King Hezekiah, son of Ahaz. And that symbol that we see up above, that seal, not found in the Ophel excavation, but it says the same thing as the Hezekiah seal that we did find. And we have a bulla that's been blown up in the lower portion on the right-hand side, a fragment of a bulla that's been magnified for our ease of seeing, that says, oh yeah. And now I look at that and it looks like one of the cartoons of the Angry Birds, but no, it may well be a falcon on this Hezekiah seal. So take that for what it is worth. Well, next week we will cover King Hezekiah, and I look forward to sharing that story with you because it is a good lead in to the pool of Siloam. Until then, may the Lord bless and keep you. It's been fun spending time with you. Take care and God bless.